One of the things I like about covering indie games is that they tend not to have such an overwhelming preponderance of coverage from bigger channels. I don't think it's a coincidence that my most successful quote-unquote video since starting this little side project was the Neon Abyss review, a game I've seen zero coverage of anywhere else. It's easier to feel like the big fish when all the real big ones are obsessively covering Starfield and other games that people actually care about. In that spirit, today's subject, Moonscars, is possibly the most obscure game I've ever covered. Seriously, this one doesn't even have a TV tropes page, even Neon Abyss managed that. Moonscars is a 2D Souls-like heavily evocative of Castlevania. In what is quickly becoming a chorus in my indie game coverage, that's a genre that's pretty oversaturated in the contemporary indie scene as hopeful aspiring devs chase Hollow Knight's success. In fact, now that I've covered roguelike, boomer shooter throwback, and bleak atmospheric puzzle platformer, I think I just need quirky management game to complete the trend-chasing indie grand collection. Maybe that's an overly harsh tone to take early on, but in my defense, Moonscars definitely wears its inspirations on its sleeve. It's a 2D hack and slash set in the ruins of a fallen kingdom populated largely by previous inhabitants turned into feral monsters. The story is presented mostly via cryptic conversations and lore snippets with little exposition, and there's a hurricane of ordinary words turned into proper nouns. Blasphemous seems to have been the primary reference point here. It's got that grimdark atmosphere with copious gore and even kind of a similar art style. That's actually a little bit unfair. Moonscars' story is a little bit more coherent than most of its peers, and unlike say Blasphemous, I broadly understood what was going on by the end. Moonscars is about a fantasy kingdom where a mysterious figure called the Sculptor figured out a way to create Clayborn, clay simulacrums of humans, to act as servants, but wouldn't you know it, they all went kill crazy and now almost everyone's dead and the Sculptor is nowhere to be found. You play as Grey Irma, an amnesiac former soldier who is awoken to find the kingdom in ruins and sets out to find both the Sculptor and her lost squadmates for some answers. One thing Moonscars does have to set itself apart from its peers is that unlike most Souls-likes, Grey Irma is actually a pre-existing character with a personality and dialogue rather than an empty shell or a mute cipher. I like the idea, but it does create an issue when you try to put a character like that into a Souls-like narrative framework. To wit, most of the NPCs talk in the standard Souls-like cryptic, vaguely sinister riddles that only make sense after finishing the story, if even then. So a lot of Irma's dialogue is just various expressions of bewilderment, which is appropriate enough, I guess, since most players will probably be on a similar wavelength, but it can start to feel redundant. Still, if we're going to have a billion games in this subgenre, I guess I can get behind some attempts to shake up the narrative. An interesting feature of Moonscars' story is that it deals heavily with themes of identity and humanity through its clay replicas, and those are the ideas you usually associate more with science fiction fare like robots or clones than fantasy. It's kind of a cool angle, though it's somewhat undercut by the mandatory Souls-like vagueness and glossary full of proper nouns. It's a pretty somber story, again basically requisite for this genre, and I think the angsty philosophical discourse and pervasive vibe of uncertainty work well with the macabre art style and grim tone. Moonscars' visuals are probably the game's most distinctive aspect. Indeed, I'll confess it's what got my attention in the first place. I think it's trying to evoke the appearance of an oil painting with somewhat ill-defined shapes and smudgy colors. It's certainly striking, if nothing else. The game overwhelmingly falls back on a muted color scheme mostly consisting of black, gray, and white punctuated with copious red highlights. I overall quite like Moonscars' aesthetic, though I will admit that between the grimdark gothic architecture and the black, red, gray color palette, this game's visuals almost seem tailor-made to appeal to me specifically, so that might just be bias talking. At any rate, aside from a monochrome silhouette section midway through, a lot of the levels look pretty similar, so I could see it getting samey for anyone who isn't into that sort of thing. Gameplay is where Moonscars feels its most generic. If you've played pretty much any 2D Souls-like Metroidvania, it's probably going to feel instantly familiar to you. Irma has a sword as her standard weapon with light and heavy attack, a range of equipable secondary weapons, and a handful of spells to supplement her arsenal. On the defense side, you can dodge or parry incoming attacks to set up a counter. I found the parry timing vexing and opted to spend most of the game counting on dodge to get me out of jams, but I've also never been very good at parrying in any context, so take that with a big ol' grain of salt. It's all around a very basic hack and slash type combat system that works well enough, but doesn't really have anything special to it either. The only thing approaching a unique mechanic in Moonscars is its approach to death. Moonscars is a system where for every X number of enemies you kill, you can choose one of 3 randomly selected passive buffs for your character. You can do this up to 5 times, and they last until you die, at which point you start the process anew. On top of that, when you die, you're prompted to select a new secondary weapon, which also have randomly assigned buffs that last until your next death. You can opt to stick with the same weapon if you so choose, but you'll miss out on that buff. Taken together, these two mechanics prod the player to experiment with new weapons, spells, and builds on the fly, as well as create an incentive to not die, besides, you know, the obvious. Thing is, though, I found Moonscars combat to be fairly easy, and I cruised through large chunks of the game without dying. That's not a brag either. I'm not particularly talented at this, or indeed any genre, so if I was breezing through it, I can only imagine that the Souls-like target audience will find it downright trivial. I will also say it's a little bit on the short side, not to the point of being downright insubstantial, but don't expect days worth of content here. I'd imagine most players would be able to knock this one out in a couple of sessions. I do have a couple nitpicks. I noticed some typos in the subtitles, and there's the occasional bit of out-of-place contemporary dialogue, as well as a recurring issue where blood spatter decals will stick to areas where there are no walls in the background. Those are just minor things though, hardly even worth mentioning. On the whole though, I'd say by the end Moonscars won me over. It appears to be this dev team's only release thus far, and that makes sense. Between the heavy inspiration from existing titles and some rough edges, it definitely has the feel of a first attempt, but the flaws are ultimately pretty minor, and I enjoyed my time with it. It has that scrappy handmade charm you can only get from a small production like this. Thinking about it, between the slightly more accessible story, short-ish length, and basic combat, Moonscars might actually make for a decent introduction to the Souls-like genre for newbies. So yeah, if you like Souls-likes or Metroidvanias, maybe give this one a look.